Welcome everybody, hello, to this major event during Expo 2015. The first part will be in Italian, then we'll move smoothly into English with our hosts and panelists. Benvenuti a tutti, allora, grazie di essere qui così numerosi in questo evento importante nell'ambito di Expo 2015, la presentazione dell'indice globale della fame nel mondo. Devo dire che la prima volta che ho visto, e sarò veramente breve perché è molto più importante sentire i nostri ospiti, i nostri esperti, ma la prima volta che ho avuto in mano l'indice globale della fame nel mondo, e non è stato molto tempo fa, un paio d'anni fa circa, grazie a Giangi Milesi di Cesvi, sono rimasto molto colpito perché è un quadro semplice, chiaro, netto, non solo della fame nel mondo, come è lo scopo dell'indice, ma della situazione mondiale complessivamente, soprattutto quest'anno. C'è un mondo in bianco, e tutti l'avete visto, lo vedete qua, e c'è un mondo invece colorato. Il mondo in bianco è quello che sta bene, che non soffre la fame, siamo noi. Il mondo colorato, a vari gradi di colore, di tonalità, è il mondo che via via soffre sempre di più la fame. Forse il mondo in bianco, e non bianco di pelle ormai, e per fortuna, credo, il mondo in bianco dovrebbe avere presente nelle scuole, elementari, medie, superiori, questo indice. Forse andrebbe appeso nelle scuole, perché diciamo, i ragazzi e le ragazze in bianco devono sapere che ci sono gli altri di vario colore e a vari gradi di sofferenza e di fame. Quest'anno l'occasione è molto importante perché si legano tante cose. La fame naturalmente, le cause della fame, andata calando, lo sapete tutti perché siete nel settore e chi non lo sa lo capirà benissimo grazie agli interventi, va calando la fame nel mondo, è calata negli ultimi anni di quasi il 30%, però la fame nel mondo è sempre più legata alle guerre, ai conflitti locali, internazionali e quindi ai flussi migratori, come sapete bene e sappiamo bene, da qualche anno a questa parte e da quest'estate soprattutto a questa parte, visto che ci siamo svegliati un po' tardi, ma forse finalmente ci siamo svegliati, dai flussi migratori. E quindi le tre cose si legano: Expo 2015, cibo, fame, guerre, piccole e grandi, tribali e internazionali, pensate alla Siria, che le ingloba tutte, per esempio, ai vari livelli e a vari gradi, dalla superpotenza alla guerra di clan, e fenomeni migratori. Quindi è giusto adesso dare subito la parola, con questo auspicio appunto che questo indice venga appeso, secondo me, forse si potrebbe anche fare qualcosa nelle classi del mondo in bianco per sapere che c'è un altro tipo di mondo tutto attorno, dare la parola ai nostri esperti, ma soprattutto giro la parola a Daniela Bernacchi, che di Cesvi è il General Manager.
Buongiorno a tutti, inizio con una breve introduzione in inglese, giusto perché ci sono tanti ospiti fra di noi. Quindi, welcome and good body to everybody on behalf of Cesvi and Allianc2015. I'm very proud to have so many people in such a crowded conference room, people coming from very far away countries, and it's a pleasure to have them here to talk and listen with us to such an important theme that is hunger. In particular, as an Italian, it's an honor to see people from such countries where the problem of hunger is present nowadays. Italy is a wonderful country, known all over the world for its good food and for the arts. This is a country where the humanism first and the Renaissance then gave birth. A movement that put the man at the center, the man at the art. And nowadays we can still admire these masterpieces all over the world. So coming back to food and human being, today we will talk about the issue of lack of food and the impact on many people and the consequences for many populations. So now that I've said I'm so proud of my country, let's switch to Italian. Please allow me to talk in Italian. Nuovamente benvenuti da parte di Cesvi ed Allianc 2015. Oggi è l'Alliance Day 2015 qui in Expo Siamo molto orgogliosi di aver portato per la prima volta il lancio internazionale dell'Indice Globale della Fame in Italia. Ormai siamo alla 10ª edizione, ma questa è la prima volta che avviene nel nostro paese. Questo ci rende particolarmente orgogliosi. Seguirà la presentazione dell'indice una tavola rotonda, European Leadership on Hunger from 2015 to 2030, quindi dai Millennium Development Goal, dai Sustainable Development Goal. Attorno a questa tavola rotonda ci saranno persone chiave della cooperazione internazionale, ci sarà la Commissione europea, le ONG, operatori umanitari, università e istituti di ricerca. Insieme discuteremo del contributo che l'Europa potrà dare alla lotta alla fame nell'ambito della cornice dei nuovi obiettivi globali. Colgo l'occasione per ringraziare tutti i presenti, in particolar modo ringrazio il commissario generale di Expo, Bruno Pasquino, che è qui con noi, il suo staff, che oltre da 2 anni lavora con noi fattivamente per organizzare tantissimi eventi in Expo. Siamo molto orgogliosi che Milano e l'Italia in particolare abbiano deciso di trattare il tema della fame, dando per la prima volta spazio e voce alle organizzazioni come la nostra, alle organizzazioni della società civile. Ringraziamo la Commissione europea che ha collaborato alla realizzazione di questo evento ed è oggi qui rappresentata da Bernacchi, Vice Capo Unità Sviluppo Rurale, Sicurezza Alimentare e Nutrizione di DEFCO, e da Enrique Trautmann, Capo Unità Politiche e Tematiche di ECO. Ringraziamo l'IFPRI, l'International Food Policy Research Institute, che ha scelto di essere con noi in questo lancio internazionale dell'Indice Globale della Fame 2015, e naturalmente, last but not least, i nostri partner di Allianc, che insieme a Cesvi hanno creduto alla grandissima opportunità di essere in Expo per testimoniare l'esperienza di organizzazioni internazionali e la nostra professionalità nel promuovere la sicurezza alimentare e nutrizionale e il diritto al cibo per tutti. Cesvi e Allianc 2015 in Expo hanno realizzato 30 giorni di eventi, quindi una maratona molto, molto faticosa e molto appassionante. In questi eventi hanno partecipato le famiglie, hanno partecipato i decisori politici, hanno partecipato i media, hanno partecipato le aziende e, come diceva giustamente Luca, hanno partecipato le scuole, perché è importante, scuole di ogni ordine e grado, abbiamo qua studenti del master, ma abbiamo avuto anche bambini delle elementari, perché è importante che venga sensibilizzata la nostra generazione futura al diritto al cibo. Abbiamo iniziato a maggio con una bellissima mostra, Uganda Land of Hope, una mostra fotografica, il viaggio di 7 ragazzi nelle zone rurali dell'Uganda, e in questo modo questi ragazzi hanno potuto meglio comprendere, meglio capire quali fossero i progetti di sicurezza alimentare di Allianc 2015. Abbiamo svolto importante partnership, stretto alleanze importanti con Slow Food, Altro Mercato, il Ministero degli Affari Esteri e della Cooperazione Internazionale ovviamente, fino a giungere alla tavola rotonda di oggi con la Commissione Europea, grazie al suo contributo. Ma l'impegno di Cesvi Allianc non finisce qui, abbiamo un altro prestigiosissimo evento il 19 ottobre a Bergamo, sede dell'headquarter di Cesvi. Sarà presente il Ministero degli Affari Esteri e della Cooperazione Internazionale Paolo Gentiloni, assieme al Ministro delle Politiche Agricole Maurizio Martina. Insieme a loro parleremo dei risultati di questa tavola rotonda, parleremo di legacy di Expo, parleremo di cooperazione internazionale e diritto al cibo per tutti. Quindi la tavola rotonda di oggi indagherà il ruolo degli attori europei, in particolar modo parleremo del nesso tra fame e conflitti armati, un tema attualissimo che tocca migliaia di persone, conflitti che spingono spesso le popolazioni in fuga a disperdersi in condizioni di terrore e di precarietà assoluta. Ebbene, Cesvi e Allianc da anni lavorano in territori di conflitto, siamo in South Sudan, siamo in Mali, siamo in Somalia, in Siria, ma siamo anche nei paesi limitrofi, dove spesso queste popolazioni sfuggono e trovano accoglienza in territorio che non hanno magari loro stessi i mezzi e gli strumenti per assisterli. Quindi mi auguro che oggi tutti questi numeri e i fatti, ma soprattutto ritorniamo agli human being, le storie delle persone, perché dietro ai numeri ci sono gli esseri umani, ci aiutino a capire meglio il complesso mondo dell'aiuto internazionale e per garantire sempre di più sicurezza alimentare, nutrizione adeguata e diritto al cibo per tutti. Grazie.
Grazie Daniela Bernacchi. La parola adesso a Bruno Pasquino, che è commissario generale di Expo 2015. Bruno Pasquino, Expo 2015 Commissioner General, please.
Thank you very much, grazie. Thank you very much. It won't take time, even though as I said in other occasions since the beginning of Expo, it is a rather difficult task you asked me to develop today, because I have some of you knew that I have a double hat in this case. I'm representing Expo, so my welcoming remark is an Expo welcoming remark, of course. But the colleagues of the European Union, probably they don't remember me, but I've been for 2 years head of the unit at the Minister of Foreign Affairs dealing with ECHO, especially ECHO, but also DEFCO. Especially ECHO, because I was the head of the unit dealing with humanitarian and emergency help. It's a special unit in the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So when I received this invitation, I actually once again thought that I had the chance of giving you a welcome remark as Expo Commissioner General, as you just said, but also as a former humanitarian, say, not volunteer, because I was a member of the diplomatic career, the Italian diplomatic career, but as we said several times, once you go humanitarian, you can never leave this humanitarian side. And I'm very proud, actually, to be here representing the two. First of all, because as you just mentioned, and you too, it's Expo which has to be proud that you chose our location to present such an important, with no rhetoric, I'm not trying to flatter you, such an important event. What you were saying about the schools in Italy, it's not only Italy, that wide part must be aware of what is going on in the rest of the world. We had over 60 million IDPs, internally displaced people. Unfortunately, not only because of let's say crisis, what we called man-made crisis, basically, wars, revolution, civil wars especially. I remember I started those 2 years, very challenging 2 years, 2011, 2013, with the Libyan crisis. Then we went on with Sahel. Then we started with, unfortunately, Syria, and it's still going on. Expo gave a platform since at least, say, 6 years ago. This recognition of the importance of your work was recognized long before Expo was let's say, and I'm talking to the Italians here now, those who were certain or uncertain that Expo will be taking place, and we're talking of 2010, 2011. Expo recognized the importance of your task. Expo is proud to have you today because you are giving content to us. You're giving you probably have heard that a couple of days, 3 days ago, actually, there was this beginning of the closing period of Expo. That is basically what is going to be after Expo. You are part of this unmaterial legacy which Expo longs to be. We want that Expo will be present, the content of Expo, and you are giving content to this special event Milan has created. This is the first time you mentioned that an international, a world exhibition like Expo receives what we call in Italian civil society, the NGOs, the volunteers, even the companies working in order to make this world a better world to be. We do hope that thanks to your pressure, let's be clear, even the following expos will accept this kind of legacy, because it's important that no matter what the theme, the basic theme, the main theme will be, it is important that this idea of giving a platform that everybody will use in order to deepen concepts like helping the others, making this world a better world to be, this is going to be, must be, we do hope to be, as citizens, not as members of Expo or civil servants. This is the legacy we want to keep after Milan Expo. So, coming back to the welcoming remark, with no rhetoric, with no intention of flattering, we must be thankful that you chose us to present this kind of, to have this event and not only this event, as you were rightly mentioning. You had the help of very brilliant people. You were mentioning it. It was very kind of you to mention, because they work really hard every single day to ensure the presence of not only of your organization, but all the organization. But it was important that you chose Expo, that you bet on Expo Milan since the beginning, when probably the others didn't believe that it was going to happen. So thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much for the content you're giving to the Expo. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Bruno Pasquino. Now, for the opening speech, I ask you to come to the podium, Dominic MacSorley, who's president of Allianc2015 and CEO Concern Worldwide.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will be speaking in English. Let me just begin by saying I think we had a launch of the Global Hunger Alliance a number of years ago in Dublin, and there was maybe 3 rows of people. So I don't know what it is about Milan and the Expo, but it is fantastic to see so many people here. Really, really delighted. As President of Alliance, I just want to say a few words. We have a great panel of distinguished guests lined up. I think we're going to have an interesting and informative afternoon. I think we'll come away having learned something. But I think importantly, I think and I hope this is going to motivate us and focus us and make us even more determined to do something about this. We can't just give you knowledge and leave the room and then forget it. We want people to really take something away and do something with this. But I guess it's important for me to explain who the Alliance is. Allianc2015, probably many of you haven't heard of them. Now, I am with Concern for 33 years. You know, when you stay with an organization that long, nobody else will hire you, which is why I had to take the top position. It's the only way they can get rid of me. But I was around in 2000 when the Alliance came together, and it was a group of people like this room, that came together around the ambition of the Millennium Development Goals and said, there's something here, and maybe if we could get some NGOs to work together, we might be able to increase the impact. And that's how it started. It was a small idea with a big ambition. And today, the Alliance is a collection of 8 European NGO members: Italy, Ireland, Germany, Czech Republic, Sweden, Denmark, France, Germany. One organization from each of these, and the Netherlands. And collectively, because it's the last one, and collectively, we are a group that works across 89 countries across the world. That's a huge, huge span. And we have a singular focus, and the focus is now being renewed around the Sustainable Development Goals. And that is particularly important. And the 3 areas that we are focusing on, the 3 pillars, are around humanitarian or emergency response, long-term development, and policy. Those are the 3 things that the Alliance has set itself out to do. And the truth is, when you look back at the achievements of the Millennium Development Goals, you know, there was significant progress. The world is definitely a better place. There was an economic engine that fueled much of this. But the reality is more girls are in school. More countries have stronger economic bases. The number of people living in absolute poverty and the number of people suffering from hunger has reduced. But the job is far from finished. And we are now on the starting point for a new and even bigger ambition that was laid out in New York a couple of weeks ago with the Sustainable Development Goals. Hugely, hugely ambitious. And the big difference is they're universal. It's really not about rich countries helping poor countries. It's actually a global ambition. And the interaction And I think if you look at the refugee crisis in Europe, you will see that universality, the problems over there, are not over there anymore. You look at the challenge of Ebola, and we see that the world over there, actually, we're all interconnected. So universality is already with us. And the challenge of the Sustainable Development Goals is how can we collectively move forward on that? You know, Ban Ki-moon said that at the time of launching the Sustainable Development Goals, that this is a time of turmoil and it's a time of hope. And the hope really is in the fact that progress has been made. The knowledge, the science, and the resources to actually achieve the end of global poverty and global hunger are there. So the science exists. We pretty much know what should happen. The turmoil certainly is particularly in the last number of years with the growing inequalities and the conflict which we have now seen that has escalated. And there are now something like 15 active conflicts across the world. And the impact that that is having, particularly in countries that even were doing well, take Syria, for example, you know, a country that was never classified in the least developed, but now the statistics after a number of years are driving that down. And we were even commenting, take a number of those countries that are in grey up there. These are countries that don't even have data. And many of those countries are ridden by conflict. So until we tackle the issue of conflict, we're not going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. But you know, I got to say, it's appropriate, I think, that we're here in Italy on the front line of what the European crisis in the last number of weeks. And I think we're all very aware, and we're acutely aware, that the crisis in Europe actually springs from a much bigger problem. And tackling the root causes of this is now really the moral challenge, and one of the moral challenges of our time. Concern is working in Syria and Lebanon and Turkey, as many of the alliance partners are. And we've seen firsthand the harrowing choices that people are making, the desperation. And these are people that, you know, are do not even have the ability to leave or to get on a boat or to flee. The reality is that conflict is such a huge issue. It is development in reverse. It destroys farms, it destroys health centres, it destroys schools. And it actually completely undermines the ability for international aid organisations or local government or national organisations to access those areas. I can tell you, we have no international staff that have crossed the border from Turkey into Syria for the last 18 months. Not possible. So this is the challenge ahead of us. I think it's a challenge for us as individuals, as citizens, as members of the EU. I come from Ireland. This is a country that has known both hunger and conflict. And in part, because of that history, Ireland, the NGOs and the government have committed ourselves hugely to the fight against global hunger. But I think Ireland can do more. And I think that they have a role to play in conflict mitigation and conflict resolution. We have a neutrality, and we must now start speaking out. You can be a small country, but you can have a much louder voice. And in some cases, it is the smaller countries that can have a bigger impact. Less political agendas and a greater degree of neutrality. So I would be urging them to do that. But we're going to hear about conflict and we're going to hear the impact. I'm going to close by talking about promises and talking about broken promises. Because we already promised a lot in the Millennium Development Goals, and boy, are we promising a lot with the Sustainable Development Goals. We're making big, big promises out there. And people need to be aware. The people at the end of the line, Ban Ki-moon has said that we will leave no one behind. Leave no one behind. And we will go to the farthest first. Those are great statements. And that means the people that are struggling to survive on less than $1.25 a day, that can't feed themselves, the ones who always get left behind, they are the ones that we say will now come in. That's the challenge. And conflict, if it is allowed to continue, will never, never enable those people to come to the top. There's a quote in the SDGs. It says, "Sustainable development cannot be realized without peace. We must redouble our efforts to resolve or prevent conflict and to support countries emerging from conflict situations so as to lay the foundations for sustainable development." That's a great statement. That's an important statement. I will say that when we look at Syria, when we look at South Sudan, when we look at Yemen, when we look at the Central African Republic, we can see, as Alliance, as anyone, we can see where our humanitarian efforts are saving lives, but we also see where our humanitarian efforts are falling short. Humanitarian aid is essential, and the budgets, by the way, are not big enough, but they should never be used, and it should never be used, as a substitute for failed diplomacy or a lack of political will to find solutions. And it is this political will that has haunted for generations our ability to end poverty and hunger. And we can go back, I'm going back to June 1963, at the opening session of the World Food Congress, when John F. Kennedy said, and we like quoting John F. Kennedy because, you know, he's got an Irish connection, and, you know, we're looking for connections. And he had an attractive wife, and the whole thing. He said at the World Food Congress in 1963, "We have the ability as members of the human race, we have the means and we have the capacity to eliminate hunger from the face of the earth in our lifetime. We need only the will." That was 52 years ago. We're richer, we're more connected, we're better informed. We and the humanitarian community have an obligation to speak out on the urgent need for greater political will to prevent the appalling levels of suffering and horrific brutality that now seem so commonplace. Over the next decade, all of us Alliance members will continue our fight against hunger, and we will continue to work against the tide of rising conflict and violence. We will also continue to call for leadership in our home countries and at the EU level. Leadership in the fight against hunger, leadership in ending conflict. Those with whom and for whom we work deserve no less. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Dominic. Now, for the presentation of the 2015 Global Hunger Index, Maximo Torero. He is Director of the Markets, Trade and Institution Division of the International Food Policy Research Institute. Please.
Good afternoon to all of you. I'm going to present the Hunger Index. Let me first start by saying that the number of hungry people in the world remains unacceptably high. About 795 million people are chronically undernourished, while more than 1 in 4 children are stunted and 9% of children suffer from wasting. So all those numbers are completely unacceptable, and we need to do something. So it's not only an issue of statements, I think it's an issue of action. And one of the things that the Hunger Index tries to bring is numbers that will allow us to track and to look to the performance and to evolution and see how we can work on those to try to improve. So the Global Hunger Index of 2015 is extremely important for several reasons. One of those is because it raises awareness. We need to see how we are today. We need to compare to where we were in the past and see how the changes are improving us and how we are moving forward in terms of improving in what is happening. So we need to show progress or not progress, and to allow competition between countries so that they understand how they are located relative to others and how they can improve over time. Because, as I mentioned initially, we cannot have the numbers we have today in terms of hunger and malnutrition in our current society. It also helps to highlight successes and failures. And today, we will relate this to conflict, and see how conflict is creating some failures. Not only failures in missing data, as it was mentioned before, but also failures in policies. Because even in some countries where the hunger index has deteriorated over time, and I will explain that later, there is no conflict, so something is wrong. It's also what we call a government failure or a policy failure. It also provides incentives to act and improve the international ranking, and it focuses on the major hunger-related topics every year. So every year we have a thematic topic that we work to try to improve on the hunger index. Now, the hunger index was designed in a very simple way. Many people complain, oh, you don't have weights, you don't have sophisticated weights. But the approach that it was taken to move ahead in the hunger index was to have a very simple mechanism to compare different dimensions that were essential to measure hunger. So essentially we work on 3 dimensions. The first one is inadequate food supply. The data mostly comes from FAO. The second one is child undernutrition. The data comes from UNICEF, WHO, and the World Bank. And the last one is child mortality. During the years, we have been trying to improve the quality of the information. And this year, there is a methodological innovation in terms of how we construct the index. For inadequate food supply, we still are working with undernourishment. For child undernutrition, we move forward and improve that measurement. Before it was only underweight, because it was the indicator used in the Millennium Development Goals. But now, in this new hunger index, we are using wasting and stunting, 2 new dimensions that compose that second dimension of the hunger index. This is pretty important because it helps us not only to move forward from the Millennium Development Goals to the 2 indicators which are now present in the SDGs, in the Sustainable Development Goals, but also help us to understand how obesity is also related to the problem of malnutrition by separating between wasting and stunting. And finally, child mortality remains the same, and we use basically child mortality under 5 mortality rate for children. Now, each of these dimensions have a similar weight, exactly the same weight, 1/3. Only in the case of the second dimension, because now we have 2 indicators, we have split that in 1/6, 1/6. So if you add 1/6 plus 1/6, you get to the 1/3. So that's how the hunger index is being calculated. Very simple, not too much of a complication, and allow us to have a very simple way to combine these 3 dimensions, which are essential for trying to understand hunger over time. The second innovation, which started last year, is that we collect this data over time. So not only we have the hunger index for today, but we can also compare backwards, for example, to 2000. So we have reconstructed the index backwards to 2000 to be able to compare the changes. This is essential because that is what allows us to be able to capture if there is an improvement and how big is the improvement, or if there is no improvement and where we are failing. So the new decomposition of the second dimension and the time numbers over time allow us to have a significant improvement of this hunger index. The hunger index is calculated for 117 countries. You saw all of them. You can see all of them in the map. The 2015 hunger index is a reflection of 2010 and 2016 period because some of the data not necessarily is from the latest year. And this raises the issue of the importance of having pretty good data. Not only data on the indicators, but also when we look at the case studies, it's essential to have very good data on the policies being implemented and good evaluations of why the policies were successful or unsuccessful. Normally, we focus on successful policies, but it's also at the same level of importance to understand why policies fail and where we have to learn from there. And as I mentioned before, this hunger index is composed of 3 dimensions. The standardized scores for the 4 indicators are aggregated to calculate what we call the GHI score, and the GHI score could increase or could decrease. If it decreases, it means that the hunger situation is worsening. If it decreases, it means that it's an improvement. And we'll normally move from 0 to 100, which is the level of the score that we are working on. Now, if we want to look at the different types of elements of childhood malnutrition, which is what I was referring when this new decomposition of the second dimension, children is normally, if you look in the following picture to try to simplify the concepts, basically, there could be the case of a children which is wasted, which means it's low weight for height. So the height is okay, but the weight is low. Stunted, low height for age. And underweight, which is low weight for age. As you may imagine, I don't fit any of those categories. So it's very important that we understand the concepts because this allows us to remove from the complex definition of obesity and how it could be heightening problems of undernutrition and hunger. So it's wasting and stunting, the two indicators that help us to better understand what is going on with the hunger index. And this is basically a picture showing you the concept. Look at the blue line for a 9-year-old kid, and look how all these kids basically are under that situation. This is the case of stunting. Now, how has this been progressing and how we have been working in terms of the reduction of stunting over time? And the beauty of the hunger index is that we can decompose and also look at the different elements of the three dimensions that we were talking. So basically what we are showing here is the number of countries on course to meet the global index targets. So initially in 2014, we have 24 countries that were on course, what we call green color. And look how we are looking at the difference over time. So there has been a significant improvement in countries moving to what we call the green color, which is basically on course. In the off course, the orange line, we have from 66, we have moved down to 60 because of the improvement in the green line. And of course, the red line has been reduced from 19 to 15. So clearly, there has been an improvement over time of what we refer as progress on stunting. So there has been progress in terms of reduction of stunting. What happened in terms of waste? A similar situation. The greens are improving from 59 to 67, but the reds basically only reducing in 1. So there is significant work still to do in terms of what we call wasting, which is an important problem to still look at it. Now, one of the beauties of the GHI is that it provides a scale. As all scales, it has to have some level of arbitrariness, but at least it helps us to look at certain thresholds. So the scale is divided in 5 dimensions. The green is what we call the low. The 10 to 19.9 is what we call the moderate scale. Remember, the higher the number, the worse the situation. It goes from 0 to 100. Then we have the serious scale from 20 to 34.9, alarming from 35 to 49.9, and extremely alarming, which is bigger than 50, lower than 100. So the minimum score is 0, the maximum is 100, but normally we won't have those cases when we look at the scale. Now, what has been the progress in terms of the GHI severity? In terms of the green scale, we have 42 countries today from the 117 that we were working, moderate 23 countries, serious 44, and 8 countries are in alarming conditions. Thank God we don't have countries in extreme alarming conditions, although some of those could be in the missing data, because those are countries on conflict. But up to now, in the ones we can collect the data, we only have 8 countries in alarming conditions. And as I mentioned before, there has been a global improvement in terms of the hunger index. This is the map that you can observe there. And what is shocking of seeing in this map is that if you look to South America, with one exception in Central America, and if you look to Eastern Europe, most of it is green. Means no alarming, good conditions. Now, South America has been the land of food in the last years. Since the food crisis, most of the increase in food supply has come from South America, especially Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Argentina. So it's good that they are green. But they have countries like Peru, for example, that have a significant success. Also Venezuela, and I will explain that later. But there are countries in Central America which are facing serious problems. And one of those, of course, is Haiti, where the issue is not conflict, but the issue has also been natural resources. But if you look at Africa of the Sub-Saharan, there are still several countries which are in what we call moderate, despite some of the improvements in some of those countries, like the case of Ethiopia and other countries. But Zambia, for example, is an alert. Why Zambia is in a moderate situation, given the huge natural resources they have. So that's what I will call a country with a policy failure. Not necessarily a conflict, because there is no conflict in Zambia. And in Asia and South Asia, still we see significant issues, and countries like India, for example, which are in a moderate situation. Now, if we divide this by regional GHI in each of the regions, the world, Africa, south of the Sahara, South Asia, East and South Asia, Near East and North Africa, Eastern Europe and Commonwealth of the independent states, and Latin America, you will see that basically South Asia and Africa south of the Sahara are the ones that have the highest levels, although they have an improvement. You see a reduction in the different levels of the index, and also here you can see the decomposition of the index in the 4 elements that compose the 3 dimensions we have been talking about. At the global level, you will see the decrease in the index which is important. There has been an improvement, but still the absolute levels are extremely high. And there is a lot that needs to be done and a lot that needs to be learned from the countries that has been successful, like the case of Brazil, for example. So improvement, but still levels which are unacceptably high that we need to keep improving and keep changing and avoiding these type of situations. The other beauty of this index, as I mentioned before, is that we can look at changes over time. So this map shows the country progress in reduction of GHI scores, percentage change in 2015 compared to 2000 GHI. And for this, we have standardized the index with the innovation that we did this year backwards to 2000. And as you can see, whenever you see a green color, means that there is a decrease in the index, which is 50% or more. When you see a red, means an increase in the index. So we cannot see reds. We only see dark oranges, okay, which are decreases, but very small ones. But we see also significant decreases bigger than 50%. But again, as I mentioned before, my major concern, and where I think we should raise this issue, is the enormous amount of still dark orange colors there, showing that the decrease have not been at the level that you will have liked to be able to improve and reduce the problem of hunger in the world. This is basically showing the countries that have a significant improvement in the index. And there are several countries, despite the absolute level. For example, if we look at Ethiopia, I don't know if I can, oh, sorry. If you look at Ethiopia here, okay, the level is pretty high, the absolute level in 2015, but it has improved substantially, more than 40%. Okay, so there has been a significant improvement, but still the level is too high. On the other case, if you look at Cambodia, which have gone through a huge reform in terms of food security, Cambodia has a low level, initial level, and also keeps improving substantially. Brazil is out of the scale because it has basically reduced the index in 2/3. So in terms of absolute levels and in terms of change, it's completely improved relative to what I can observe here, which is restricted to 50%. So again, there are countries from where we can learn. There is a lot that we can learn from Cambodia, from Vietnam, from Ethiopia. But cases like the Ethiopia one still need significant improvement and significant change to be able to keep in the path they are today. Now, what are the key findings of the indicator, of the first part of this presentation? First, in 2015, developing world GHI fell 27% relative to 2000 score. This is a significant improvement relative to 2000. Second, Africa of the Sub-Sahara and South Asia have the highest level of hunger with regional scores between 32.2 and 29.4. That means in absolute levels, still they are extremely high. And despite the improvement and the good experience in some of the countries, the levels are too high. From 2000 GHI to 2015 GHI, 17 countries reduced their scores by 50% or more. Those are the success stories. Those are the cases we need to go in depth and try to analyze the cases to be able to understand what they did correct. But also, my position will be that we need to go to the countries that the scores were the lowest, so the highest in absolute value, but they have improved the least. Because in those we can learn to which policies have failed and from where we need to change in the future. So in terms of absolute progress between 2000 and 2015, Rwanda, Angola, and Ethiopia saw the biggest improvement in the scores. However, significant declines in the GHI scores, their hunger levels remain too high, as I mentioned before. The second finding is that the countries with the highest 2015 scores, and therefore the highest hunger levels, were the Central African Republic, Chad, and Zambia. People of the Central African Republic and Chad have violent conflict, as I mentioned before. And these have increased substantially, and it will be presented in the case after this presentation, and this has created these significant levels of GHI, of the hunger index. The countries with the highest GHI scores tend to be those engaged in recently emerged from a war. And the table following shows that. Look at the case of Chad, the case of Zambia, the case of Timor-Leste, Sierra Leone, Haiti, which was accompanied with a huge natural shock, the earthquake, Madagascar, and Afghanistan. The only exception is Zambia. And I don't know if any of you have been in Zambia, but Zambia is an amazing country. Extremely good land, extremely huge amounts of natural resources, minerals, oil, etc. So it's unacceptable like a country like Zambia is in the same situation as these countries where there has been conflict. And it has the level of hunger index it has today. So for me, that's clearly a government or a public policy failure. The other countries are countries with conflict, where, as I will explain later, there are other issues that we need to take care to be able to resolve those problems so that we don't fall in these situations. Because when you are looking at sustainability and hunger, you can fall once and you can try to recover yourself. But if you fall twice, it's very difficult, at least in the literature, on what we have looked in the evidence, to come back again. We normally will fall in what is a poverty trap, and we will stay there, and we won't be able to come up. And also there is a significant damage to the young generations, to the kids under 5, because of malnutrition, which it will affect their future in the future lives. The other thing that we have tried to bring in this hunger index is to bring dynamic maps so that you can look at tools in the web and try to access to it. So we have dynamic maps, and these are just examples, where you can see and look at the evolution of the index over time in the different countries that are part of the hunger index. You will also have in the report that all of you have in your hands the detailed table indicating the composition of each of the indicators over time so that you can assess the scores and how they perform and evolve country by country over time. Now, there is a group of countries where there is lack data, and that obscures the hunger levels. And that's something that we need to look at it, and we need to find ways to create the political pressure for that data to be released. We don't want those countries that are in gray there in the map. We want to move out of that and to be able to collect the data, because it's the only way that we can push for policies that could help to move these countries out of the current situation that they are. Sadly, those are the countries that normally were before in what we call the red situation. And those are the countries that today we cannot measure how they are. So this is strange. We need to create the pressure, and that's what the hunger index document is trying to do, to avoid them to be in these extremely high situations and to have the data to show if this still remains or there is an improvement. So there is a lot of effort that we need to do that to improve what we call these obscure levels of data collection. So let me finalize with 3 conclusions. The first one is that there has been a tremendous progress towards the elimination of global hunger. The level of hunger in developing countries has fallen by 27% since 2000 in a period of 5 years. And 17 countries reduced their hunger scores by 50% or more relative to 2000 global hunger index score. One of these countries is Brazil. Now, but this was not done for free. Brazil implemented in the last decade an enormous amount of programs and reforms that allow them to reduce the inequality in terms of access to public services, allow them to have very targeted transfer programs, like the program they have on cash transfers, and many other policies like the PEA program, for example, for extension in agriculture based on incentives, which allow them to move to this situation. The only sad part of the story of Brazil is that there is very little impact evaluation of the policies they implemented. And the World Food Programme is doing a huge effort to collect that data and to document all the policy processes that allow this to happen. And this could be very useful in the future for other programs to imitate. Now, despite the progress made, levels of hunger remain serious, as I mentioned before. So absolute levels still are alarming in 52 of the 17 countries with GHI scores. And still, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have 795 million people which are chronically undernourished, and 1 in 4 children are affected by stunting, and 9% of children are affected by wasting. So still, we need to do a huge improvement to be able to continue in this path of progress. The second conclusion is the issue on conflict, which is strongly associated with severe hunger. Again, look at the word here. We talk about association, not necessarily causality, because you could have in both ways. Conflict could create hunger, but hunger also could create conflict. Remember 2007, in the food crisis? There was clearly a situation because of the spike in prices and the excessive volatility of prices, a lot of conflict was created. But there are other situations where conflict by itself, because of external reasons, creates significant problems of hunger, and I think lately we are observing those cases. But again, one of the most important messages here is that we cannot keep growing if we have huge levels of inequality and huge levels of absolute poverty and hunger. That will create, for sure, a conflict, local or international, but could affect, as we know now, will be associated with severe hunger issues that we need to focus. There has been also other problems, but that's crucial of this hunger report, that we need to look at it carefully. Finally, reduce armed conflict and extreme poverty and addressing their consequences are key for ending poverty. All people, no matter where they are or where they live, have the right to protect from famine. Humanitarian aid should not be subject to political interest. I was amazed, but when I was in the G20 of Paris, one of the recommendations that was coming through the G20, remember, the G20 of Paris was in 2009. It was in the moment of the highest price spikes after the 2008 and so on. One of the major recommendations was to move food across countries when there were humanitarian situations. And in G20 processes, all the countries have to agree to be able to move a recommendation. And we couldn't do that recommendation. There was always countries objecting to that policy. And when we were able to agree that WFP was the only one, because initially we want any country to be able to move, was the only one to move food in a case of an extreme situation, it was rejected in the WTO. So the recommendation was never implemented. So these type of things are unacceptable, and these are the things that we need to change if we want any progress in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maximo Torero. Now we stay on the Global Hunger Index with Professor Alex Deval, Executive Director, World Peace Foundation, Tufts University, and he will present us the contribution to this year GHI.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be associated with the Global Hunger Index and all the organizations that have been involved with it. I will use the Nigerian custom of saying all protocols observed, so I can get straight to the substance of my presentation, which is really a presentation of good news, an optimistic and positive message. And I want to put up one graph, if we could move on to my first and my only slide, up. Next one, please. There we are. This slide is a representation of the numbers of people killed in famines by decade over the last 150 years. Now, by famine, I do not mean chronic hunger. I do not mean the everyday problem of malnutrition, of wasting, of lack of food on an everyday basis. I mean those particular episodes of outbreaks of severe hunger that kill hundreds of thousands or millions of people. And for this, we collected information about more than 100 episodes of famine over the last 100 years. And we looked at those episodes that had killed 100,000 or more people, the so-called Great Famines, and those episodes that had killed 1 million or more people, the so-called calamitous famines. And we plotted them over time. And what we see is enormous progress. Look at that graph. Look at that line going down. Now, as Dominic had said, if President Kennedy had stood in this hall 52 years ago, in the early 1960s, and had said, great famines, calamitous famines, will be conquered in our time, many people would not have believed it. That was at a time when a great famine, a calamitous famine in China, caused by the policies of Chairman Mao, killed perhaps 30 million people. Between 1958 and 1962. It doesn't appear as a 30 million peak in this graph because it is divided between those two decades, 15 million in the 1950s, 15 million in the 1960s. Yet, those disasters have come almost to an end. And that is reason for hope. That is reason for a message that if we put our minds to it, we can solve these problems. So let us not give in to the naivety of cynicism, the naivety of those who say, oh, there's nothing we can do about Syria, there's nothing we can do about Somalia or South Sudan. We can do it. We have done it in the past, and hunger is one of those problems we can solve. Just one summary point from this graph. In the 100 years from 1870 to 1969, about 140 million people died in these famines. 140 million, that is 1.4 million every year. In the last 25 years, about 1.4 million people total have died. So the total death toll in great famines over 25 years is equivalent to the annual death toll for 100 years leading up to 1970. Now let me just make a few brief points about understanding what has happened. The first is geography. More than half of those who died in these famines died in East Asia, and particularly in China. China was the land of famine. In fact, there's a book called China, the Land of Famine, published in 1926. China is no longer the land of famine. After China, you would not guess it, but the continent second highest in the ranking was Europe, because of the famines that struck Russia and the episodes of mass starvation that occurred in Ukraine in the 1930s and during World War II, including the Dutch hunger winter, the last famine in an industrialized country in Europe. South Asia is next. Africa, overall, is a small part of this story, but Africa is the most persistent part of the story, and the Middle East also. The next key theme I want to highlight is many things have happened over this 150 years. You see this line generally going down. There are many lines going up. Some of the lines going up are lines to do with world income. People are more prosperous. Communications. There is much greater world trade, much greater communication. World humanitarian effort has gone up. Also, world population has gone up. Over this time period, it's gone up from about 1.3 billion to 7.3 billion. We still hear people saying overpopulation is a problem. But those people who have been predicting over the last 30, 40, 50 years, world population growing will cause famine, look at this graph. It does not. It proves the opposite. It shows the opposite. The enormous improvements in public health. If we look at the death toll and famines of 100 years ago, the great majority of that death toll was not hunger per se, but diseases associated with hunger, smallpox, cholera, measles, waterborne diseases. Enormous improvements in public health have brought those down. But the single most important cause, I submit, is politics. If you look at these famines, you can look at them individually, and you can look at the specific causes of each one. And the great and calamitous famines fall into several categories. They're categories of famines caused by colonial conquest. And this happened in China, in India, in Africa, in the late 19th, early 20th century. They're famines caused by war, massive war, the Nazi hunger plan, the wars in China, the war in Biafra in the late 1960s, which I believe was one of the reasons why Concern Worldwide was founded nearly half a century ago, the war in Ethiopia in the 1980s. And as the number of wars have come down, so have the number of famines. And I will get back to the point that not quite. And lastly, the decline of totalitarianism. The greatest and most terrible famines were associated with totalitarian systems, with communism in China, with Mao Zedong, as I mentioned, with Stalin in Russia, with Pol Pot, and the last great famine in Asia, the famine in North Korea in the late 1990s. And this brings us to the truth of an observation made by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen, which is that the true driver behind the reduction in famines is the increase in political freedoms, the increase in democracy, in communication, in the free press, and in the mobilization of citizens. And this is the core message, that if people mobilize, if they use their freedoms to mobilize against a problem, that problem can be solved. And I believe that is the underlying story here. Now, there's one last point I want to make, which is you will see right at the end of that curve, it went down and it went up a little bit. The last 7 or 8 years have not been good. They have not been good for conflict, and they have not been good for famine. We have seen preventable famines. We've seen preventable famines in Sudan, in South Sudan, in Somalia, in Syria especially. And these are famines that are associated with war and with the acts of men. And forgive my gender-insensitive language here, because famine is a man-made phenomenon. It is not a woman-made phenomenon. And I want to point, therefore, to the key policy conclusions that come from this. Resolve war, and you can resolve famine. And the second one is that even in war, humanitarian agencies, where they can get access, are now extremely effective at preventing starvation and disease. So what are the obstacles to access? And I want to single out one in particular. There are many that come from local warlords, local dictators, etc., but one that we can do something about, which is the US government makes it extremely difficult for humanitarian operations to operate in areas where there are organizations that are designated as terrorists. So that if an organization like, let us say, Concern Worldwide, were to be seen to be giving food that might, not for sure, just might be taken by a terrorist organization such as Al-Shabaab in Somalia or the Islamic State in Syria, it could be prosecuted. And I think that is an abrogation of the humanitarian imperative. It is unethical. And I think we should all campaign for a policy that people who need aid, who need life-sustaining sustenance under any circumstances should be entitled to get it, irrespective of whether they are living under a government that we recognize or under a tyranny. So let me leave you with that point. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You want to stay here and sit here?
Okay, let me do it.
We are finished with the presentation of the Global Hunger Index. And so you understood how many things there are in this map of the world. And not just hunger. It explains a lot of the world we are living in. Alex Deval is sitting with us here, as the other people will be doing very shortly. Dr. Pauline Riak, please, can you join us? Matthias Mogge, please. Enrique Trautmann. Again, Maximo Torero. And also, last not least, Bernard Ray.
Yes. The question is the same for Enrique and for myself. So you have to choose to which one. This one.
Okay. Okay. I will ask some questions. I will start with Professor Riak, Sadi Institute, South Sudan. Thank you very much for being here. And several questions for all of them. Then you can ask some questions. Professor Riak, this year's case study on South Sudan talks about a situation where conflict, climate change, and hunger are colliding as a perfect storm, adding to the hardship and vulnerability of ordinary people. Could you give us some insight into the lived reality of people in South Sudan today in terms of how hunger and conflict is affecting them? You can speak here. You can with this microphone. Is it working? Yes.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, this is interesting for me to see so many of you. I'm not going to assume that you know where South Sudan is. But if you take a ride straight through Italy, you get to the end of Italy, keep going. Through the water, you will hit Egypt. Keep going. Along the River Nile, and you will find us to the south of Sudan, and Sudan is to the south of Egypt. On the maps that you are looking at, we are in gray. So there's no information for the index concerning South Sudan. It is important for you to know that for the past 250 years or more, South Sudan have been at war. We have been bombarded on an almost permanent basis by the Egyptians, the British, our relatives in North Sudan, because we're a very rich country, rich in any way you can think of. And people who see riches like to pull riches. I would like to suggest that all the wars on earth, today and in the past, had three reasons. One was a small group of individuals who wanted political power. The other was this group that needed resources. And the third was over women, or call it the family if you like. So any war on earth, as I can remember, just had those three reasons: men searching for political power, or resources, or, I say women, you may say families. In South Sudan at the moment, while Italy is bearing the brunt of many people from our continent coming north, we only leave our homes when we are in danger. There's nobody who wants to live in anybody else's country. I want to live where I was born and where I grew up. But as an individual, I have been bombed over 3 times by my own government. Bombed. And you know, as human beings, you cannot tell when you're going to be bombed. But the chickens can, the dogs can, the goats can. So when you see the domestic animals making certain sounds, you know you better take cover in little holes under the ground. You hear it? It's coming, and you take hold under the ground. When violence strikes, you leave where you are living because all you are concerned with is survival. If you have a child or children, you can leave the children. You may grab the nearest one to you. Your human instinct tells you to run. So in South Sudan, for over 250 years, we have been running. You, as the global community and the media, you know about the past 50 years when we were being bombed by our government in Khartoum. And 3 years ago, we decided as a nation to break away and become the youngest nation in the world. And then 2 years ago, either because of the wish for political power, or the wish for resources, or the wish to protect families, or for women, whichever of the three, our leaders decided that they would go again to war. This is a long story, but essentially, when you are under oppression, you fight back as a human being. We broke away from Khartoum because we were being oppressed by, I said, the British, the Egyptians, and the Khartoum government. And then we had great expectations. We wanted to be free. We wanted to be independent. We had a liberation army and a liberation movement. And throughout our continent, liberation armies and movements seemed to do very well by mobilizing the people. We were very well mobilized, and we fought consciously. And it reached the point where we had an election, and we voted 98% or more for the government. Our expectations were that we would govern ourselves, we would protect ourselves. But when we gained the independence, the political leaders were the military leaders. And so, you know, when you are a general you are accustomed to say, move it, and people move. When we became independent, our army officials who became political officials were unable to move the liberation struggle now into a development mode. We are a very rich country. The lady who spoke before spoke of the beauty of Italy. I think it is competing very greatly with the beauty of South Sudan. We like to eat, and our food is very good. But when you are under bullets, you have no time to produce food. And then climate change, I don't know where it's coming from, that's not helping us either. Because even if you want to produce food, there are no, well, the rain does not come, or the drought comes. So you have floods, you have droughts, and you have bullets raining down on you from your male relatives. Women and children are the most that are affected. I had the unfortunate or the fortunate incident of going into the war zone. I am a troublemaker. I like to see where my sisters and my children, I like to see and feel and hear what is happening. So in December of 2013, when we fought, I went in with other people. And I'm sorry to tell you this, but there were dead people. There was this one like this. You could see it like an old woman trying to run out of the building and being bulleted. There are thousands of people, because when I went, people were not yet buried. In a trauma like that, you run for your life. And wherever you go, now some scholars, probably including some here, have talked about an ethnic war. The war in South Sudan is not an ethnic war. It is a war between those who have the bullet and the rest of the people. I say that because you have people running of one ethnicity into the land of people with another ethnicity and living without antagonisms, without tensions, and without violence. South Sudan is a beautiful country. It's a country that is extremely rich in any way you want. Some people from the north, when they come south, they say, hey, if you plant a human being here, he will surely grow. That's how wealthy the place is. But it is at the bottom of the level of all the scales you can think of, the global human scales. We are at the bottom. A ray of hope. We are 3 years old. I want you to think of yourselves, your nations, when you were 3 years old. And unfortunately, the men of the world have gone crazy, but they were always crazy. They like to fight themselves and in the process kill their families. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Riak. After this, let's move a little bit to Europe, to Bernard Ray, who is the Deputy Head of Unit for Rural Development, Food Security and Nutrition in DevCo in Brussels. And I will ask him about the European Commission. What has the European Commission done? And has done a lot of work to improve nutrition across the globe, recognizing that it is a fundamental pillar of food security and that a child's life prospects and their country's future welfare is dependent on nutrition security. not least within the first 1,000 days. In situations of conflict, how can we ensure we keep nutrition outcomers in mind? And that relates also to what Professor Riek said.
Thank you very much. Grazie. It's difficult to take the floor after such an eloquent speech, Madame. And I think you have very well illustrated the difficulty we are facing in a development agency and a development funding agency like the European Commission. We have two colleagues here. My colleague is working on the humanitarian side, and I work on the development cooperation side, and we make all possible efforts to complement each other. And of course, hunger is an issue on which we find each other and on which we collaborate each other. In the development world, we have an advantage of defining some concrete targets of what we want to achieve. And when the European Commission is the first donor worldwide on food and nutrition security issues and sustainable agriculture, the issue of a concrete target, a concrete objective that we could rally behind in all the countries where we intervene was an important one. And stunting has been chosen as one of the best indicators to reflect effort and to reflect an impact of development cooperation activities. And the Commissioner for Development of the European Commission committed at the London Hunger Summit that the EU would assist partner countries in getting 7 million children out of stunting in the coming 10 years, and committed to mobilize the resources behind. Situations of conflict, of course, create an additional difficulty to reach that objective. When you want to fight stunting, you need, or it's important because it is multidisciplinary. You have many things which contribute to the reduction of stunting. Human health, an agriculture with a diversified diet, water, sanitation, and you need a good enabling environment. And of course, conflict, the first impact of conflict is a disruption of this enabling environment, and that makes things even more complicated. So even when you have protracted crises, which are crises which last several years after a conflict, after a drought, or another man-made disaster, food and nutrition security is particularly difficult. And then we try to make sure that women, pregnant women, women with children under 2 have the possibility to breastfeed their children properly and have the shelter they need so that stunting can be reduced. And then you have a number of concrete actions that you can do under these circumstances. But what is important to retain is that we are very conscious that the damage created by this disruption of food and nutrition security related to conflict can have a legacy of damage many years after the conflict has ended. And probably this is where we try to work in good connection between what we do with a humanitarian response to make sure that the conflict does not increase the burden created on human welfare by the stunting situation in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now the word to Enrique Trautmann, Head of Unit of Policy Unit, European Commission. She's responsible for the whole range of thematic and cross-cutting issues related to humanitarian aid. We have a global humanitarian funding crisis on our hands, Enrique. In relation to Syria alone, the shortfall in identified needs is $4.7 billion. And there are many more conflict-based crises, such as the Central African Republic, Yemen, Somalia, that are less than 50% funded. There's been investments announced in relation to dealing with the refugee crisis and with its root causes. But how much of this is new money? What kind of choices are you facing?
Thanks a lot, Luca, and hello to everybody, and thanks a lot to the organizers of this very topical event today. I mean, in a way, it's good news. The hunger indexes are going up, i.e. hunger is going down. In a way, it looks better, but certainly from a humanitarian perspective, we have the impression that it's actually getting worse. And it's getting worse for a couple of reasons, and you touched upon them, and various colleagues have touched upon them in the last hour that we've been discussing here. We have more and more crises, we have more and more complex crises related to conflict, and we have more and more crises in the so-called middle-income countries. 6 years ago, we couldn't imagine spending about half of the budget that's available worldwide for humanitarian aid and rising on a Syria conflict. A conflict which is completely different from the ones we're used to, and also resulting in needs which are very different from the ones we are used to. If you have Syrian refugees, I mean, you know, Pauline knows that in the countries we've been traditionally working, like, for example, Sudan, classically you give them food, you give them plastic sheeting for shelter, you give them water, a couple of other things. In the Syria crisis, you have refugees who need diabetes treatment, who need dialysis, who want education, and I'm sure the Sudanese also want education, but it is much more prominent. The level of expectations for humanitarian assistance and for development assistance in these conflicts have grown enormously, and so have the costs. And that gets us to what Luca was just mentioning. We have an enormous underfunding for humanitarian budgets worldwide. We haven't had for a couple of years, and it's not necessarily getting any better. Now, there's a little bit of good news on the EU level. As you've seen in the context of the Syria crisis, the EU 2 weeks ago has allocated a lot of additional money for the so-called roots causes of the Syria refugee movements in the countries in the question. So there's more money for Jordan, for Lebanon, for Turkey, for Iraq. But at the same time, we know that if we can't stop these crises, it's not going to make a difference. We'll be able to pay more, to pay more money to our partners who work in the refugee camps in the region. We'll hopefully be able to raise again the level of assistance that's giving per refugees to the people who fled Syria. But we know that if they don't have an amount of hope for the future, it's not going to stop refugee movements. And I want to be very clear, we don't do humanitarian assistance in order to stop refugee movements. But we also have to be very realistic. If there's more funding available now for these things, it is because the refugees are basically here in Europe. And all of a sudden, people have woken up and said, well, you know, what's happening there? Where have these people been before? Well, they actually fled 4 years ago for the most part, but they've been in the region. Now they're moving. And that is actually a double problem, because it's a problem, well, let's say it's a challenge for Europe to really welcome all these people, but it's also a problem for the countries they fled. It's an enormous brain drain, because the people who are now leaving and who are potentially not coming back anytime soon, unless the conflict stops, and even then, they are needed in the countries where they come from. And that's an issue we're facing everywhere. So basically, what we need to do is to do something about the root causes. We need to be able to give more assistance, but we also need to be able to find a way out of the conflicts we're all facing. Now, one thing, apart from spending more money on these issues, is also to spend it more effectively, and that's something we've been working on for a long time. We think that as much as we think that food assistance is still needed in some contexts, specifically if you don't have functioning markets, we think that the way to go in a lot of contexts is cash-based assistance. People who are suffering from conflict and have needs also want to be able to make choices. They want to be able to make a choice between getting food for the children, but also maybe getting a little bit less food, and on the other hand, getting education for the children. They want to be able to do debt repayments. They want to be able to have a certain autonomy and dignity in their situation, which is difficult enough. So that's one of the issues that we really want to be seeing much more also in a humanitarian context. Just to answer your last question, the choices we have to make, they're enormous. For the time being, we're looking at a better 2015-16 for the Syria crisis context, because we've allocated €500 million extra for this. That means we have added a quarter to the 2015 budget and about a third to the 2016 budget. But there are a lot of other crises. We're still trying to keep the same level of assistance also for the Sahel, for the Horn of Africa, Yemen, Somalia, Sudan, and so far we're managing because for the time being there's more funds available. But it is clear that if you also want to touch upon countries which has been mentioned earlier, like Guatemala, which is a country that has enormous food and nutrition needs, you will have to be able to really spend money very effectively to have enough left over also for the countries which don't have a conflict, which are less in the international media attention, but are nevertheless suffering from enormous consequences. So we're doing our best, but it is a challenge.
It is a challenge, yes. Now to Matthias Mogge, Welthungerhilfe's Executive Director of Programs. Thank you very much. What are the main challenges for organizations such as the members of Allianc2015 providing humanitarian aid to people affected by current violent conflicts?
Yeah, thank you very much, Luca, and hello, everybody. When I entered this morning the room, I had a brief chat with Henrike, and we both noticed that we were desk officers responsible for Sudan back 15 years ago. And at that time, we were, as Welthungerhilfe and many other alliance organizations, distributing food aid, fishing lines, fishing hooks, agriculture utensils, etc., etc. We are still doing that. We still have to distribute all these relief items for survival to people who are affected by the terrible conflict which is still going on. This is a terrible situation. What has become maybe different is that relief workers, aid workers, and in particular our national colleagues are under attack very, very much, and much more than a couple of years ago. This is not only true for Sudan, but this is true for many other countries like Central African Republic, like Afghanistan, like Darfur in Sudan. So that's a big, big threat for the humanitarian community. Which is also maybe more difficult than in the past is to get access to those who are really suffering. If you look at Syria, I mean, it is easier to provide relief, to provide aid to those who have escaped Syria, but to provide the necessary aid to the people who are still in Syria is getting almost impossible today. And this is our big, big challenge. Today's conflicts are lasting often very long. And what we see is a lost generation. You can see that already in South Sudan, but also in Afghanistan, for example, and in many other conflict-prone contexts. And we still have to find ways in dealing with this huge problem. Yeah? We are losing a generation who has not been able to receive a proper education, who is, of course, we are talking today about hunger, yeah? Who is stunted, who is malnourished, etc., but who has also no education, and we are in a downward spiral, and it will take really a long, long time to get this generation back into a development mode. So this is a big, big challenge for us today. When it comes to funding, Henrike said already, the donor budgets are stretched. There are so many conflicts at the moment, and there is a huge, huge need for funding. What we get as an NGO community is short-term funding, but what is really missing is a more long-term approach, a longer-term perspective, and more predictability in our funding. I think we have made quite some progress in being better coordinated within our alliance, but also with the UN, and also, if possible, with the governments. I think that's really important, and I think we have made really progress in our coordination efforts, but I think this is still a challenge to get better, and in particular to get our national colleagues in these coordination mechanisms.
Thank you very much, Now we go back to the lack of data, as we learned before, and we go back also to Maximo Torero. You already met him. Every year in the GHI report, we talk about data problems, lack of data, poor data, or late data, so on. Enormous challenge when it comes to situation of conflict. South Sudan, again, this year, we can see as a no GHI score, but we know that hunger is an enormous challenge here, and you told us. But how much sharing of data is there? And what scope for greater collaboration in sharing data about hunger in countries suffering conflicts and other crises?
Okay, thank you so much. The issue of data, I have to be more positive. There has been significant improvements in the last years to make data public. Enormous amount of initiatives to make the data public. Like several years ago, it was impossible to get data from the National Institute of Statistics, for example. Today that has improved substantially, although still we have a long way to go. So that's a positive thing that has been happening in the world. And it's as simple as trying to get, for example, the household surveys, statistics on nutrition and so on, has improved substantially. On the other hand, if I move to the other extreme, when we have issues of conflict, and it has been so graphically described, we have this rain of bullets. Governments are fighting between each other. The last priority they have is to have a strong statistical unit that will be collecting this data. So I think for us to expect that to happen is a mistake. What we need to do is to find ways in which we can find alternative mechanisms that will at least give us not necessarily the first best indicator, but a second best indicator or a third best indicator. And there are ways we can try to do that. And that's something that we need to think carefully for the future, I assume, in the GHI. One way to do it, as you know, cellular phones are massive. Media tools are massive. So one way to do it is to try to collect data and certain types of indicators through these networks and trying to identify at least locations where the situation is critical. We have methods to do that will allow us to at least alert the locations within countries that the situation is critical through the massive amount of tweets or messages, SMS messages, when there is high penetration of cellular phones. And that could allow us to collect data. It won't be perfect, but at least from there we can move and try to put pressure to go and collect better data in those locations. So the message I want to give is that although there has been an improvement, I think we also need to keep innovating in ways we can get data for those countries, because we won't be able to rely on the national agencies and the national institutes. Normally, we won't be able even to rely on international organizations going in there to collect the data because of the security issues. So we need to find alternative mechanisms to reduce that gap, because it's important that they don't stay gray in the map. It's important that at least we have an indicator, no matter it's not perfect, but to tell us how alarming is the situation so that some policy or actions could be made. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maximo. Back again to Alex Deval. You wrote an open letter to Gail Smith, President Obama's nominee to head USAID, asking her to take the pledge of no famine under my watch. While the US is the largest single donor in terms of ODA, the EC and EU member states together are the largest providers of humanitarian and development assistance. Shouldn't this no famine under our watch be part of our more global humanitarian commitment? In what respect would this be a game changer?
The first response that I have is a very simple one. Yes, I think it should be part of a global humanitarian commitment. And very shortly there will be chosen a new United Nations Secretary General, most likely from this continent, and that individual should take that pledge. The other point to make is that it's not just a matter of resources, it's also a matter of policies and commitments. It's not just a matter of knowing that famine is preventable and providing the resources and the commitment to providing humanitarian response. And all those are necessary and good things, and the European Union and the EC member states are very much in the lead in that, and good for them. It's also an American commitment or requirement, also an Asian one and an African one. And the African Union is emerging as a very powerful, very influential multilateral organization and player. The point I want to make in this regard is that we also need to address the question of the legitimacy of war. The former head of peacekeeping at the UN, Jean-Marie Gaheno, recently wrote an interesting article saying that war has somehow become legitimate. We have world leaders talking about victory instead of about peace. And this is very disturbing, especially when you are engaged in an unwinnable war, like the war on terror, which will never be won. So in order for us to shift that dialogue towards really solving the problems, we need to have a 1945 moment again. When in 1945, the nations of the world came together, not only to pledge to end the scourge of war, but also to end the scourge of hunger, of forcible displacement, and to set up the institutions to do that. And we have those institutions, we have those commitments, but some have strayed from understanding quite how important it is to have a collective multilateral commitment to these principles and these institutions. And I think that reaffirmation from the top needs to be made as soon as possible and by all concerned.
Thank you. Thank you. Alex. There will be time for more questions from you, from the audience, but I will ask some questions again to our guests. Professor Riak again. What do you see as the biggest barriers to food security in South Sudan today? And what can be done about these barriers?
I would say we have two huge barriers: attitudes and government policies. Attitudes, because for the past 50, 60 years of war, we have been receiving food from the outside world, from the people who love us. That created a dependency syndrome, that when the bullets stopped, we refused to plant anything. So that all the food we eat, well, almost all the food we eat now, come from outside South Sudan, although South Sudan could be the breadbasket of the world. So that's in terms of attitudes. In terms of policies, for me, it is very simple for the government to say, for the nation, I give you 3 years in which you can import food. After that, you want to die of hunger, it's your problem. You must plant food and put in place, through the Ministry of Agriculture, the extension agents, the proper seeds, the proper whatever is needed, so that we will know in a year and a half, we are all supposed to be able to feed ourselves. And if we don't want to, then we can join those who have gone before us.
That's okay. Thank you very much. Bernacchi, in 2013, the Commission launched its action plan for resilience in crisis-prone countries. It was hugely ambitious and joined many dots, having been developed by ECHO and DEVCO in cooperation with the European External Action Service. It provided frameworks for development, which focused on peace and state building, addressing climate change and disaster risk education, food security and social protection. 2 years on, how's it going?
Thank you, Luca. Resilience. Yes, that was a very ambitious document that we put together and that we presented, but a needed one. A needed one in the face, taking the aftermath of the crisis in the Horn of Africa in 2011 and in the Sahel in 2012. And we try to bring all of that and think, okay, how can the Commission work better? How can the European Union work better, bringing together all the tools, all the mechanisms that a political actor like the European Union has. So it was combining practices of better adaptation to climate change in these areas, measures of reduction of disaster risk reduction, humanitarian assistance, the diplomacy that we have and that we can mobilize behind, as well as the development resources. All of that to say that in those geographical areas of the continent, in particular in Africa, but not only in Africa, we can have societies, households that are better equipped to receive shocks and are better resilient to recover. Better said, they will not be so affected. They will leave the shock better, and they will recover better from these shocks when they have occurred. And crises, conflicts, other shocks exist, and they are all treated in the same way. And through this philosophy, this way of working with different services of the European Commission, we have been establishing responses in the Horn. We have been leading with a number of member states the response in a program in West Africa, which is called AGIR, which has been implemented with the regional authorities and with a number of very concrete mechanisms like regional food reserves for the countries of West Africa, but also a better way of manage data and collect data. And I come back there. Very important, we have been financing not only the data collection, but the capacity of the administrations in the region to manage, to assess, and to draw lessons from those data in terms of preparing themselves for a better response. So for us, if you want, through these various interventions, we really try to say that we need to, of course, to reduce the risks that a crisis happens. Of course, we are doing that through diplomacy in a number of cases. We did it in Central African Republic, where we assisted, as the EU, the Africa Union to organize a debate, a policy debate, a political debate to confront the crisis in Central African Republic. We also need to have people to make sure that the impact of the crisis is reduced on the people. That's the second perspective. And of course, we have to prepare people, and we have to prepare the societies to work better after the occurrence of the crisis. So this is this continuum, mobilizing all the various instruments we have, from diplomatic instruments, humanitarian, development, even the missions, like military missions in certain cases, that we can mobilize as the EU, together with a number of member states of the Union, which brings the EU as a political actor in these type of situations, and which is assisting countries to be more resilient to the crisis, and in particular to the food crisis, but not only, but those ones being really those which are dominant in these situations of crisis. Thank you very much, Luca.
Thank you. Enrique Trautmann, let's go back to what you were saying about the refugee crisis, which is a very visible consequence of horrendous conflict, as you said. Ongoing in these people's home countries, more than 80% of the people fleeing war stay within their country or a neighboring country. Is there a risk of the current refugee crisis in Europe absorbing the majority of new funding, leaving the crisis in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and Syria underfunded? How does the EU best respond in a joined-up way?
Thanks a lot. Maybe I'll take the floor, since I have the floor, just add something to what Bernard just said about the resilience action plan, because that, as you know, was a joint ECHO-DEFCO exercise. And maybe just to come back to what resilience is all about. It's about not doing the same over and over again if you can prepare for it. It's basically about preparedness. We, and Matthias touched upon it already, we've been funding the same stuff in the same countries for sometimes decades. The humanitarian aid, being a short-term instrument, is rolling over the same projects year after year after year because basically nothing changes. And the whole point of the resilience approach has been to say, if we know something is going to happen, and we know a lot of things these days, then let's prepare for it better, and let's make sure that the populations have a better chance to be resilient to what's going to come to them. One of the examples is the oncoming El Niño phenomenon. Most of you are probably aware that this is going to have major impacts in the next 1 or 2 years on a lot of countries worldwide with a very different outcomes, very different results, but in a way that needs the humanitarian and the development community already now to look at ways to tackle that and to come in early. There is basically the calculation of the World Bank and the GFDRR saying that $1 invested in preparedness is going to save you $7 in response. These are the kind of things we have to keep in mind, and this is why the Resilience Action Plan, which is indeed ambitious and very multi-layered, is still, as a basic vehicle for us, very important to really be serious about preparing against the disasters, be they conflict-induced, be they natural disasters induced that are coming towards us. Just one example, and then I'll stop and try to answer your question. There is a joint development humanitarian program in Ethiopia, which is called RESET, which is looking at exactly that, to have a multi-year, also coming back to what Matthias was saying, a multi-year perspective, both from the humanitarian and the development side, to allow populations to be fit for the next shock and the stress that is definitely going to come their way, because they happen to live in countries which will suffer from these things. Now, on the refugee crisis, I mean, it's a huge challenge for Europe, and it's really a challenge for Europe as its basic premises of being a community of solidarity that's really being tested. Now, humanitarian aid doesn't, for the most part, act inside Europe. There is the civil protection aspect, which is, as we know, very prominent in Italy, so Italian civil protection and the other civil protection departments in the member states are trying to work in the countries with the refugee influx. We have been doing very limited funding for the Western Balkans, mainly Serbia, to help a little bit with management of refugee flows there and basically just giving them basic needs of a bit of food and shelter. But for the time being, the main impetus and the main accent for us is still in the countries of origin, i.e. in Syria, as much as there's access, and in the neighboring countries. Now, with the additional funding made available now, and with our attempts to spend it as effectively as possible, we hope that there is still enough funding left for other countries, specifically on the African continent, which are bearing the brunt of refugees worldwide. I mean, of course, now in the European media, all you see is refugees in Europe, but still the vast majority of refugees and IDPs are close to the country where they come from, and that is the sub-Saharan regions, that is in South Asia. And we shouldn't forget that nobody is paying attention to that, and not a lot of help is going to the governments who more or less host them to help them in dealing with that. But it's always coming back to the same issue. If we are not able to create a perspective for people who have been forced to leave their home country, if they don't have any hope for either having a better life in where they are now, or to come back at some point, then it's an issue that we're not going to be able to stop. And we're not going to be able to close the borders and say, well, we go back to what we have before. It's nothing we have to deal with in Europe. It's enough if we give a bit of money to humanitarian aid, and then this issue will stay away from our doorstep. It will not, and that will mean a lot of political commitment to tackle the root causes in the countries we talk about, and certainly the European Commission is doing its best to do just that. Thank you.
Thank you, Enrique. Matthias Mogge, Mali is an interesting case. It's also an example of a multiple crisis leading to severe food insecurity. What has led to the crisis in 2012, and what was Welthungerhilfe's approach?
Yeah, Mali was chosen as two of the case studies you can find in your folders. So it's it's not easy really to explain all the causes which have led to the conflict in Mali. And I think that would be really difficult here, really to explain all these causes. But I think one of the features which is maybe valid for Mali, and this can be also valid to many other conflicts, is that in particular the young generation, young people are fed up with the current system and fed up with their governments, fed up with corruption, fed up with inequality, fed up with elites who put money in their pockets or take the money out of the country to maybe to Europe, to some bank accounts in Switzerland. Yeah. Young people are fed up with this and often have no perspective, in particular job perspectives, where they are. And I think this is one of the reasons for the conflict also in Mali. I'm saying this is one of the conflict because there are many, many others, and the experts maybe also here in the auditorium, they will say, yeah, but there is also this or that, yeah. But nevertheless, I think if you try to understand why are people becoming so radical and extremists, I think very often the root cause is loss or missing perspective. And this is, I think, true in particular for the young generation, for young people in many of the countries where Welthungerhilfe, but also our Allianc2015 partners are working. So what were our approaches in the conflict situation? We were trying to continue our programs. And Henrique was just saying, I think the most important programmatic approach is building resilience. Because we have noticed we are giving relief and food aid again and again. So the big task is how can we make the societies we are working in more resilient. Second thing is to become more political. One thing is to provide humanitarian aid, but the second thing is, I think, to support in particular local partners to hold their governments accountable for what they do. Yeah, because we want to tackle the root causes in the long run. Second thing I mentioned already, very strong coordination among the alliance members, but also with the UN, for example, in order to have a very efficient aid approach, relief approach, so that not two organizations are doing the same thing in the same spot. Yeah. Just to name a few of the approaches we have applied in this very critical situation, but there is much more to learn also about Mali and the conflict in Mali in the brochures you find in your folders.
Very clear. Maximo Torero, two more questions, then the word to the audience. What is the link between food prices and conflict in developing countries?
Okay, so that's a tough question to ask to an economist, because I will normally look to causality, and you don't want to be bored by all the different methods we have to resolve the problem. But one of the issues, and let me bring examples of countries where we can learn lessons. Just take Guatemala, okay? Guatemala is one of the, in the west of Guatemala, as it was mentioned before, is one of the countries that has the worst levels of malnutrition and chronic malnutrition in the whole world. It's equivalent to the worst countries in Africa. Now, the southern part of Guatemala is a key producer of sugarcane. Guatemala is one of the richest countries in terms of exports of sugar to the world. Most of the east part of Guatemala, the northern part of Guatemala, has huge income. Companies are extremely profitable. One of the most important RAMs in the world comes from Guatemala. Two of them. So something is wrong, no? And private companies don't pay taxes. They have a very flexible tax system in the country, while in the west side of Guatemala, you are facing these weird situations, post-conflict, because Central America had a huge conflict, but extremely poor people. So those inconsistencies clearly will create conflict. And if you have seen the news in Guatemala, there was huge corruption in the government, vice president, the president, and what did the people do? Basically, they were able to push them out of the government, and today they are in prison. So huge conflict as a result of that huge inequality. Will this be resolved in the future with the new government? Nobody knows. Again, the lack of institutions is essential in this relationship between conflict and food security. Another example is my own country, Peru. Peru lived through a huge war since 1967 to 1992, which was composed of two groups, the Maoist group, Shining Path, that many of you know, but also a guerrilla type of group, which was the Tupac Amaru. That war completely messed up the country for more than 2 decades. And just in the last 10 years, Peru has improved its growth substantially, but they still have huge inequality. So despite the huge macroeconomic reforms that were able to improve the situation of the country, we have been growing 7% or more in the last 10 years. Today we are around 3 because of the global value issue of the crisis at the global level. But despite that, we are facing a wall of growth today because of the huge presence of inequality. So unless we do significant reforms, we will go back in a cycle to the potential conflict, despite all the improvements. So again, the message is institutions are crucial to avoid this type of relationship that we are facing. Many of the reasons of the conflict could be because of access to money or to resources at the global, local, or international level. But also it's because of the presence of these huge levels of inequality and disparities that create this situation, because the people are pushed to extreme situations where they cannot anymore react rational, and they basically want access to things. Now, when we talk about food security, I think it's a big mistake to think it's just agriculture. If we want to eliminate hunger, this is a multi-sector problem with a multi-dimensionality of impacts. We need to look at the health side, we need to look at the education side, we need to look at the access to infrastructure side. It's a multi-dimensional aspect. And the major problem you face in all these countries is that people don't coordinate within the government and even within the private sector. So you have a Ministry of Infrastructure doing something that has nothing to do with the needs when it's a public money, which is supposed to be used to reduce inequality, to reduce poverty. So we have to look at this as a multidimensional problem with a multi-sectoral intervention. And some countries are improving on that, on trying to create ministries that coordinate all other ministries to create these compacts of goods that we need to move out of food security. But that's the only way, with these strong reforms and thinking differently, I think is the only way we will be able to move out of this. Because in most of the cases, I will think it's a policy failure. It's a failure on the side of the government. And it's not necessarily what we normally refer as a market failure, when basically by simple conditions we will operate. Normally it's mistakes in policies, lack of coordination of policies, which end creating the problems we are facing today. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Last question to Alex Deval. As we understood perfectly well from your words, hunger is related to war, is caused mainly now by wars going on. So, you say in the report that there is a need for stronger mechanism to prevent and resolve conflicts going on. What would this look like to you, and what would the role of you in this as a donor?
There's a very interesting report published a couple of months ago by the United Nations. The Secretary General set up a high-level panel on peace operations. And a couple of the recommendations are really worth looking at and thinking about deeply. Initially, the Secretary General wanted to focus on peacekeeping, on the dispatch of uniformed peacekeepers to trouble spots. But the members of the panel came out with something rather different. They said, first of all, that politics should be primary, and the politics of peace is more important than simply dispatching peacekeepers. There's a point in that, which is that also, which they did not stress, but is very important, which is that if you are serious about peace, you have to talk to your enemies. You cannot simply talk to your friends. If you take Syria, the so-called peace efforts over the last few years have been run on the basis of, there's certain people we won't talk to. Surprise, surprise, they have not succeeded. It's only when you talk to your enemies that you have a prospect of achieving peace. Another point, which is related, closely related in this high-level report to the UN, is that if the UN is serious about peace, it must make a clear distinction between peace missions and counterterrorism. The two are not the same. And the UN should not be involved in counterterrorism because it is antithetical to peace. And I think we also need to think on that. We need to have a new fundamentally new, much more political approach to counter-terrorism. So what can the European Union do? The European Union is founded on multilateralism, on the dream, and 70 years ago it was a dream that there could be peace in Europe. No one believed it could really be possible. Now the European Union could assert that, yes, there can be peace in the world. It's a dream, but it is a no less impossible dream. It is not less impossible to have peace in the world over the coming decades than it was possible to have peace in Europe 70 years ago.
Thank you very much. Any questions from the audience? Over there.
Emanuele Plata by Planet Life Economic Foundation. I would like to have by you some information about what is the impact of the industries engaged in business of instruments of death. What could be done? Where should be done? And how much should be important to win the anger? Thanks.
Who wants to answer this question?
Okay. I would be happy to answer.
Okay, please.
Okay.
Please.
It is interesting. An estimate was made that the world trade in weapons is about 3% of the world trade. Not very much. But 40% of world corruption is associated with the trade in weapons. And those who are involved in the trade in weapons are interested. They do not create jobs. They are subsidized by taxpayers. We all pay taxes. And part of our taxes go to subsidizing the production of weapons. Yes, some individuals get employed by that, but more individuals would be employed if that money was spent on social services, on education, on other forms of civic industry. The role of the arms business in distorting our politics is a deeply profound, deeply disturbing, deeply damaging one. I will leave it at that. I could talk on this for many, many hours, but I think this is really not our topic.
Torero also wants
very briefly, only to add, it's not only an issue of weapons, but it's also an issue of food quality and standards, which kill many people, and that's also related to water. So access to water of quality is one of the major problems we face and one of the major reasons why most of the programs fail. Because what you eat, and if you don't have good water, you will lose. So water is a problem, and that requires policies from the private sector and the public sector. And the last issue is how concentrated markets are and how few players you have in the world in what relates to food and processed food, which also affects lives of many people.
Okay, please.
A couple of months ago, I attended a global humanitarian conference in Geneva. It was a 5-day conference, and it was really fascinating because there were many members of the international humanitarian community who really wanted to help the situation. And I was really highly amused because we spoke for 5 days, but nobody had the guts to talk about the weapons. Where do the weapons come from? In our countries, we do not produce weapons of mass destruction. If I want to fight you, I cut a piece of stick and I beat you, or I fight you with my fist. But the proliferation of small arms and big arms, and we do nothing about it in our discussions like these. So I would really like to suggest that the international humanitarian organizations, while you do what you do best, it may help if you try to find out, well, if you try to persuade those who produce the weapons of mass destruction to do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? Over there. Laggiù. Who has the mic? Okay.
Volevo sapere quale poteva essere l'impatto del land grabbing oltre la guerra nel generare insicurezza alimentare.
The impact of land grabbing above war in the food security. Yes, please.
Land grabbing. Thank you for that question, because it's an issue which is very high on the political agenda. And the civil society has been extremely vocal on the issue of land grabbing. What is good is that the phenomenon of land grabbing, which came up it has always been existing, but it came up very strongly when the prices of food products were at a high peak some 5 years ago. And that has generated a lot of reaction. And the preparation by the World Committee on Food Security, which is a UN committee, of voluntary guidelines that governments or countries could implement on land tenure. These voluntary guidelines are really used, and they were the result of a consensus between public operators, private operators, government, development agencies, civil society, and they are being implemented in more and more countries, and they include how to respect land tenure in their traditional form, which is, of course, stabilizing the principles of land, so that land grabbing is no longer possible. So you strengthen the local mechanism. Legal, but also the one which is recognized by society. Now we have the next step, which is how can you have due diligence when there is an investment which has a subsidy or which is incentive, with some incentives through a public development bank? Because a lot of ground grabbing rests within country political system. But when you have a private investor who says, I would be interested to do a plantation, or not sometimes with a lot of land, but some activity which will generate growth, which will generate employment in the south, and that can bring capital in the south. We see now, and this is a case from USAID, the German Development Cooperation, the EU, that a due diligence principle is created so that the loan to that private operator may not be given if a due diligence has not been implemented to ensure that there has been no land grabbing process, and that the process for the use of their land is legal and recognized both by the civil society and by the government. So that's something which is really moving. The impact itself on the food security, maybe, Maximo, you can have something on that one.
Mm-hmm. No, that's sure. So one of the arguments behind the movement to land grabbing was basically to have a place where to grow food, but then to bring back that food to the country that was grabbing the land. Now, the concept grabbing I think, is a negative concept by definition. And as it was mentioned before, if we have the institutions in place in the countries where this is happening, countries that have sparse land that can be used and make it productive, if you have strong institutions in the countries, together with support from international organizations to assure the due diligence, that means that this could be related to what we call foreign direct investment. Okay, so in which conditions are put in place of what can be produced under what conditions, and also conditions on how that produce that will be resulted of that land can be shared to the country and not only to be imported or exported back to the country to be owned. If the institutions are not in place, then we could have a food security problem. And that was a little bit what happened at the beginning, because many countries jumped immediately to take advantage of countries that had very low level of institutional development that will protect them from these type of conditions. We have improved a little bit. There is more data available even of the contracts and the arrangements, and that has helped a lot to understand and to do the proper due diligence. But we need to keep strengthening institutions in the country, but also strengthening the collection of data so that we know what is happening and actions can be taken in place in case they're abusing of low development of institutions in those countries.
Okay. Please, very short,
very
because
briefly.
now, then we have to go back to Dominic MacSorley for the closing remarks. Unless
Very
there
briefly.
are more questions, but the time is very short. Yes.
Yeah, I agree. There is some hope, and there is, I think, more consciousness in the donor community, among private business and among the governments. But still, land acquisitions, land grabbing is still a huge problem, and people often are left behind. People do not get the promised jobs, and once the land is converted and land is rented out to these companies, it is rented out for the next 50, sometimes 100 years. Yeah? And that's, first of all, a fact. There are many case studies produced in the recent past, and you can go on our website to find more information on that, in particular on Cambodia and Sierra Leone.
Thank you. So one last very, very short question, please. There was someone, yeah, okay, over there.
Okay, good afternoon, thank you. I think there were a number of statements made about gender equality and its importance on our humanitarian and development and resilience building activities. And like from the practitioner perspective, I feel like we may not pay enough attention to this. Yet, wherever we work, we can find thousands of women who are ready to lead, who are ready to really develop their country. So I just would like to hear your quick observation, whether you believe that there is enough done in terms of women's empowerment, or whether we should do some more and what it would be. Thank you.
Women's empowerment. Who wants to answer? Of course.
I'll have to take that. No, I mean, it's entirely true that that this is an issue which is also not coming out sufficiently in some of the current discussions we're having on the humanitarian side. For example, in the run-up to the World Humanitarian Summit, it's all about, you know, institutions and efficiency, et cetera, but the question, how do you really empower, not only protect vulnerable groups, but also empower groups that can be empowered, is not sufficiently present. On the humanitarian side, in the EU, we have been pushing gender now for a couple of years. We've introduced a gender marker in all our projects, and we're really trying to measure gender sensitiveness. In some respects, in terms of protection of women, but not only women, also men, against gender-based violence and things like that, but also in seeing how much the projects are actually looking at gender as an issue. Another very important issue we always think is really education, and that comes back to what I touched upon earlier. This is not only for women, of course, but of course we all know that if children have to drop out of school because there's not enough money for school fees, or they have to go and work, it's normally the women, the girls who drop out first. If we bring up education also in emergency settings from the beginning of a displacement or from the beginning of a humanitarian crisis situation, then we will see eventually an effect on women's empowerment. We're completely convinced about that, which is also why we're putting more money into this kind of activity. And that is one of the issues that really is completely underfunded and needs to be brought up to the attention of world leaders, but also to the ones who take the funding decisions. That we need to work on that, and we will see an effect.
Thank you, Enrique. Thank you, everybody. Last words.
In South Sudan, we've had a very interesting situation because women were a part of the fighting group. And so the men who dominate the political spectrum seem to understand that, and in our constitution, a lot is being written, a lot is being said. 30% of our MPs are women, and 29% of the executive body. However, throughout the nation, we are still disadvantaged, but we are working on it. And what we have recognized is that our men are not resistant, as the literature says, that, you know, we're dealing with politics and no man wants, or nobody want to give up their political position. But what we have found is that when we work within the cultural dynamics of the nation, men are not resentful. And what we're doing now is to develop a national transformational leadership institute for women and men to really try to get economic empowerment and other types of empowerment to women, because we're convinced that you cannot eat empowerment. So it has to be economic in nature, although the other things will take place. So it's a very important question, and it relates not just to the international humanitarian situation, but to our own home governments. Thank you.
Thank you, Pauline. Dominic, it's up to you now.
Just a few words. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here, for sticking the pace. I'm not going to try and summarize what was such a rich and open, honest discussion. I'll just say a few things. You know, I was sitting there not using my phone, I was tweeting. So when you tweet, you have a limited number of characters. So this is some of the stuff I took away. Coordination has improved, access is a challenge, more predictable funding. Conflict-driven famine is man, not woman-made. Resolve war, you resolve famine. Attitudes and policies are key contributors to hunger. $1 prevention saves $7 response. And a longer tweet, but it came from Dr. Riek, and it's the last one I'll say. No one chooses to live elsewhere, but when bullets are raining down, you can't grow food, and you are forced to leave where you live. So that's what I took away. I guess the question is, what did you? And I think probably we heard a lot about the data and the evidence. We got the reality check from people experiencing conflict and hunger. And we've heard on European leadership from the donors, from the European NGOs, from our alliance partners, what we are going to do. I guess in conclusion, what we would ask is stay engaged, stay informed. We will have a transcript of the discussion available if people want to follow it. The Global Hunger Index moves to different cities, nothing maybe as exotic as the Milan Expo, but it is moving to different cities around the world with the same message. You were the first. And there is a responsibility, we hope, to stay engaged. And really, to conclude with what Alex said, is there was a dream in Europe many years ago, and that dream, which we need to turn into reality, is seeing the end of global hunger and global poverty. Thanks to my colleague here, to Luca, for his facilitation. Thanks to each of the presenters. Thank you really deeply to the Cesvi staff, who have been working 24 hours a day with this and with the refugee crisis and in every other country where they're working. These things don't just happen. And thanks to the alliance partners as well, and to everybody for coming. All the best.
Thank you.
Siamo giunti alla fine dell'indice globale della fame, della presentazione dell'indice globale della fame. È stato un pomeriggio molto intenso. Siamo molto orgogliosi che questa presentazione sia avvenuta in Italia e in Expo, due grandi momenti, e in particolar modo oggi ci siamo soffermati anche sul ruolo delle donne durante i conflitti, quindi che sono una categoria sicuramente altamente vulnerabile, così come i bambini, ma anche le donne nel ruolo nella lotta contro la fame, quindi il loro ruolo fondamentale nel sostenere la famiglia e la necessità anche di avere programmi sistematici. Ricordiamoci che nei nuovi Global Goals le donne sono al numero 5, Gender Equality, quindi è importante che abbiano accesso a eque opportunità, education, e i mezzi di sostentamento, perché più rafforziamo le donne, più riusciamo a combattere la fame.
Today, October 12th, 2015, we launched the Global Hunger Index here in Milan at the Expo, and there was a fantastic turnout. We had 250 people, many young people, coming in, learning about the impact of conflict and hunger in the world today. And while there is some disturbing trends, particularly for countries that are caught up in conflict, where hunger is alarming or extremely serious, the discussion also pointed to the opportunity and the hope about how we can resolve this. So we had the European donors, we had representatives from South Sudan, we had the NGOs, and we had a very, very rich discussion. What's really important is there was a lot of young people here coming to the exhibition but learning about global hunger, because it is this generation that will resolve global hunger in our lifetime.